Hi, everyone. Welcome to Generational Change, our new podcast. We hope that you love all of the episodes that we are going to have in store for you. And we are kicking this off with a brief civics lesson, Intro to Constitutional Law, followed by an interview with our first guest, Shahid Buttar. And we'll be talking about his upcoming race against Nancy Pelosi. So I wanted to take a few minutes and talk a little civics with everybody. One of the things I learned from my campaign is that very, very few people even remember civics if they were taught it. And nowadays, a lot of people aren't even being taught civics. And I think that that's kind of a very unfortunate event. So I think that we cannot expect people to participate in our system if they don't even understand the system. So I want to do like a series of explanations of basic things. And I think the best way to start is from the beginning. So I'm going to start with introducing everybody to something that I find very, very near and dear to me. Everybody should also feel the same way. It's a constitution. This is the Constitution. If you're just listening and you're not watching, that's okay, because it's probably inverted on the screen anyway. But I have a pocket constitution. I highly recommend everybody get a pocket constitution. It's a pretty good read. I got to tell you, it's not too long. Yeah, there's parts of it that are a little complicated. That's true. But it's pretty good. The people that wrote it were exceptionally bright. And I want to just start out by saying briefly what this does. Okay. So I think a lot of people think of it in the abstract and they don't really think of it in terms of how it really impacts our existence. Okay. So this is the document, the blueprint, the plan that creates our government. This is where our three branches of government are delineated and where the powers are granted. Okay. So this Constitution is made up of a preamble, which is the thing that most people know. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. Okay, that's the preamble. Then there are 7 articles that are, the original basis of our governance are these 7 articles. Okay. Then there are 27 amendments. That's a whole separate, we can do little episodes on amendments down the road. But in order to really get into what this was intending to do, I want to just go back to that preamble for a second, because in the first sentence, the whole point of this is to form a more perfect union. I think that is a very key point here, this was written to form a more perfect union. I think that that's very key. And I think that that's something that we kind of overlook. Article 1, let's start in the beginning. Article 1 is our legislative branch. Article 1 is what sets up Congress. It sets up the House of Representatives. It sets up the Senate. It delineates what their enumerated powers are, the things that they very specifically can do. One of those things, interestingly, is declare war, yet we are currently, I believe, drone bombing 7 countries, mind you, without a declaration of war. So we will have later episodes regarding how we have strayed from the actual application of our Constitution. But for now, let's just stick with what is in the Constitution, right? So Article 1 is our legislative branch. That's Congress. It is not a coincidence that Article 1 is Article 1. It is not a coincidence that our framers put the people's house as the first branch of government. They didn't start with the executive and the presidency. They started with the legislative, the House of the people. And I think that's a very key thing. We are supposed to be representing, our Congress is supposed to be representing the people. That's what it's supposed to be. And it's not a coincidence that that's the first article. Okay. Article 2 is the executive branch. That is the presidency. That includes the president, the vice president. It includes his cabinet. And it also, it includes, it's the Attorney General is the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense. These things are under the executive branch. They are underneath the president. And I think that, we definitely are in a very executive branch centric phase of our civilization right now in this country. We are seeing a very executive heavy time. And it isn't just with Trump. This has been coming on for a long time. This has been coming on with the, destruction of labor, with the increase in the military industrial complex. There's a lot of factors that have sort of led us to where we are. But so Article 2 of the Constitution, that establishes the presidency and the executive branch. Okay. So Article 3, last but certainly not least, is the judiciary. And the judiciary branch is comprised of our Supreme Court, which has 9 justices, 8 plus the Chief Justice. And then also within Article 3 are other federal courts. So let's just very briefly, we're going to just talk about how those 3 articles work together. And again, this is in theory. Okay. So the legislature, and this, we could even put it in the order of how it would go. Okay. So the People's House, the legislators, they get together and they decide, we are going to create a law that is going to make people's lives better and easier and going to help further our economy. We're going to make a good law. Okay. So they're going to go ahead and they're going to do something, let's say, I don't know, a $15 minimum wage. Okay. I recognize this is sort of fantasy land. So our legislative branch creates a law. How is that done? Okay. Now, our legislative branch is comprised of 2 houses. We have the House of Representatives and a Senate. Both of those are specifically created in Article 1. Okay. Interestingly, in Article 1, our senators were originally chosen by state legislatures. And it wasn't until the 17th Amendment that we, the people, were actually able to directly elect our senators, our U.S. senators. That was in 1913, I believe. Anyway, I digress. So within the legislative branch, we have the House of Representatives and we have a Senate. Now, the House of Representatives is based on percentage, the amount of people in the population. So every certain amount of people gets a representative. So every state has a different amount of representatives depending on the population of that state. But every state gets 2 senators. So right now we have a Congress that has 435 members in the House and 100 members in the Senate. And here's another little, we can do another little tidbit of trivia that will link over the executive branch into the legislative branch. And that is in the case of a tie in the Senate, because there are 100 senators. So conceivably, there could be a tie. In the case of a tie in the Senate, the vice president sits as the head of the Senate and he actually can cast the tie-breaking vote. It's not, he doesn't have a vote otherwise. The vice president does not have a vote in our Senate. But if there is a tie, then the vice president actually can cast the tie-breaking vote. So once we're talking about the legislative branch and we're talking about creating a $15 minimum wage law, so the first thing that's going to happen is the House of Representatives is going to assign this idea to the committee, right? There's a committee that focuses on, it would be, I don't know, labor and wage relations, or subcommittee of, I don't know. I honestly used to have a better grasp like a few months ago of all the different committees. I don't right now. So the law's created, it goes through the House. Let's say the House of Representatives votes, majority of them vote for this. Then it goes to the Senate. And then it has to get a majority in the Senate that has to vote for this $15 minimum wage. If the law gets through the House and gets through the Senate, then it goes to the president. And this is where people probably know that's where the president can veto it or sign it, or he can do nothing. And then after 10 days, it just enacts itself, it's called a pocket veto. It just sort of, it doesn't, yeah. But anyway, so that's how we create our laws. They come through the legislature, both the House and the Senate, and then they make their way to the president's desk. Now, what if the president vetoes something? He doesn't want it, even though the majority of the people want it, because remember, Article 1, the people's house, that's us in theory. So if we want something by a majority and we get that through and it gets to the president's desk and he vetoes it, then what can we do? Well, then it can still pass, but it has to pass by 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. So then that same piece of legislation goes back to the House and back to the Senate, where they decide, they vote again. But keep in mind, it could have passed with 52%, 51% of the vote. It could get to the president's desk with 51% of the vote of the House, half and plus one senator, and then it gets to the president's desk, the president vetoes it. If it barely passed, chances are they're not going to be able to come up with a 2/3 majority in each house to override the president's veto. So that's why a veto is essentially the kiss of death. It's not often going to get overridden. And so that's the basic premise of Article 1 and how it is controlled or checked and balanced by Article 2. So Article 2, remember, the vice president sits as a tiebreaker. The president gets to veto legislation. And that's really the checks on the legislative from Article 2. And so I think with that, we're going to stop here on talking about Article 1. And then I will do another section on Article 2 and really maybe get into a little bit more about the cabinet positions and the different kinds of influence that they have over the policy in the legislative branch, just by the fact of executive direction. So anyway, that's your basic Article 1. And happy civics in a snippet. Happy civics in a cinch. How about, see, I could say 60-second civics, but it's longer than 60 seconds. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, happy Constitution. Hi, how are you?
Good. My camera's apparently not in place. Sorry. Good to see you. How you been?
Good. How are you? You are our very first guest, and this is my very first time doing this all by myself, and there's no one here to help me. So this is going to be fun, and I am not the most techie person. So, but
we'll
you
get
can
there.
hear me. You can hear me, so that's a good sign.
Yep, and you're getting my audio too?
I am. We are just starting this out, and we're getting everything in ducks in a row, but hopefully going forward we'll be a lot more organized with setting it up. But
right on.
I was excited because the only time you and I ever talked was when we did the Social Security sort of panel with Alex, and we didn't really get a chance to talk. And now I feel free, like I am unencumbered and free.
Yeah.
And so
speak your mind.
Yeah. So how are you doing? How are you doing right now?
Oh God. I mean, I don't. Yeah. It's. I'm throwing gasoline on my candle at both ends.
Okay. It's
probably taking years off my life, but I'm happy to do it.
Is that why your goatee is gray, or was that already gray?
No, this campaign certainly turned me gray.
Yeah, I've had a lot of that too. I just recently described running for office as you're in the front car of a roller coaster and the back car is on fire, and your goal is to get to the end of the ride before the fire engulfs to the front of the car. Like that's sort of how it felt like to me. I mean, what are your thoughts?
It's not unfair. I mean, at different points, I've felt like I was a sail pulling a large boat and being pushed, by just frankly, the weight of thousands of people, propelling this force forward as a thing to collect energy and, share it and distribute it. I've also felt at different points like I'd been shot out of a cannon. At different points, I felt like I was strapped to the front of a runaway train, maybe the closest to your image.
Yeah.
But decidedly strapped to it and not driving it. I mean, it's amazing how.
That's the point. Like, so you say train, I was like roller coaster. That's exactly the point, is you're not driving. Right. You're just reacting. Like, it's just constant reaction every day, every minute to everything.
Well, when we sign up to react and respond to the policy issues and to our communities, I've had to respond to all kinds of things from, unethical, professional, political operatives, spreading lies about me in the press, to biased journalists, to an incumbent who refused to debate for over a generation,
Yeah.
to, obviously a political culture that is subjected to any number of brainwashing vectors, from corporate propaganda to, any number of institutions that constrain people from thinking insightfully about the challenges confronting of our society. I mean, so many of the things that are challenging the United States are frankly not that complicated. Obviously, medicine and the process of healthcare is as complicated as rocket science. And I think the battle to overcome the coronavirus will be, take a lot of expertise. The public policy about how to respond to it is frankly not that complicated at all, right?
Yeah.
Let people get access to care and medicine without cost being a barrier. That's what Medicare for all would be. And we don't do that senselessly. Have a universal paid sick leave program so people can stay home if they're symptomatic. We don't have that in place. We force people to choose between going to work and potentially infecting their coworkers and putting food on the table. It's just an idiotic policy in so many different ways. We'd have a UBI program if we were serious about dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, so that people could stay home without feeling economic coercion to put themselves and their families and their customers and their communities at risk. We don't do that either. We'd be investing in domestic manufacturing. So we'd have things like personal protective equipment instead of offshoring it all, and shrinking domestic manufacturing to whatever capacity we have for in the slave labor force in prisons. That's the extent of US manufacturing capacity at the moment. And it's just all so idiotically stupid, in addition to senseless and brutal and vicious and short-sighted and all those things. But just the sheer idiocy of it is, those are the reasons I think why you and I got in the race, right? Was to deal with these examples of stupidity that we can resolve.
And what's frustrating, as you know, is that, yes, it's not complicated. We know what needs to be done to fix these things. It's not like we need to, gather a focus group. We know what the problem is. And then to make matters even more complicated, and I know you've been dealing with this and you talked about it just a little bit, you're dealing with constant smearing and underhanded behavior from either party establishment, non-party establishment, corporate, special interest, whatever it is. So it's not even just fighting for policy. It's like you're struggling to keep your head above water just on your own in order to even do the policy. So when I first heard the stuff that was being said about you, I personally found it extremely hard to believe. And the fact that I'm doing this, I know to take everything with like a pound of salt, and know that for the most part, it's Occam's razor. And to me, the most likely answer is somebody is trying to discredit you and smear you because of what you are doing, is more likely than what is being claimed. And unfortunately, most people don't know that. So if you would just without getting into like too much detail, just sort of explain where this came from. I mean, there were allegations of sexual harassment, and I guess, on your staff. And I honestly find that very difficult to believe. And I certainly didn't believe it with regards to you personally. So if you would, and obviously none of this has even been corroborated.
Yeah, none of it is true. Also, I mean, there were about half a dozen different smears that were launched towards me by people who used to work for me, who I replaced after I won the primary. And they included first an allegation, which was false from the outset. There's no even single incident, let alone a pattern of inappropriate behavior with volunteers, which was what they used to get their concerns in the press and to weaponize DSA in the service of their campaign to destroy mine. All of them, incidentally, came from the city's progressive establishment. They now went back to the city's progressive establishment. So to your point about the many directions from which the smears come, San Francisco's progressive establishment claims to be progressive, and at the first hint of accusation here in San Francisco, threw an immigrant down a well without any evidence, in spite of evidence, and in spite of witnesses of color whose voices remain suppressed in the press to this day, 2 months later. My critics, people who used to work for me, claim now, most recently, The Intercept just wrote an article about this about a week ago, correcting many parts of its first story that it got wrong before. And my former staff most recently claimed to have accidentally accused me of assault. And it is amazing to me that anybody could take seriously a claim of assault or anything else when the proponents claim to have made them by accident. And I don't know how you accuse someone of assault by accident.
How does that happen? That's about as rational as an accidental assault. Maybe it was an accidental assault. I don't, how can you accidentally, that's just crazy. That's just crazy.
The way you accidentally accuse someone of assault is when you accuse them of a bunch of things and then get caught telling lies and need to walk them back. And, that was just one of half a dozen. Some of the claims against me, frankly, were racist. People claim that I don't work hard and that I'm paid too much. And, I put in 18 to 20-hour days. I have for, frankly, 20 years on this campaign for 3 years, longer than anybody and much more time than anybody who worked for me ever put in. And the idea that I'm overpaid is also interesting to me, because the idea that a candidate of color, and I am underpaid relative to my peers, I make less than I would have had I stayed in my job and didn't run for office. And the idea that I'm not entitled to a fair wage as a person of color who is frankly vastly overqualified for the role I'm running for is offensive to me. Just in fact, I think it was yesterday or maybe the day before, the San Francisco Bay Guardian, totally different smear, having nothing to do with my former campaign operatives who tried to light the barn on fire. But the San Francisco Bay Guardian claimed that I'm not qualified for the seat, which I just find, it's so laughably transparent.
What is that?
Racist.
What is okay? This is, and you know what? And I get that too. And I see that that's actually a common smear that's thrown out to anybody challenging an incumbent. That's often the thing. And I do believe that particular criticism is being overlooked for the most part by people. Like, I don't think that is, you'll have your handful of like loyalists to the party that are going to stick to their true blue. But I think more and more people want people that are not inside. And so what they're calling as unqualified just means not experienced at that particular office. And that is a far cry from unqualified. I would argue that anybody that can read can be qualified to do this job and represent their constituents.
I would actually push back there, and I on the last part, because I think you and I are not just anybody who can read.
No, it's true.
You and I are organizers. We've both spent a lot of time studying the issues. We've worked on the issues, both as legal advocates and as community organizers. I frankly take some umbrage to the idea that just anybody should run for anything. I don't think that's true at all.
No, I don't think anybody should run, but I think that anybody who is a member of a community would be qualified. I don't know what that means to say somebody is qualified to represent their community. If you're a member of that community and you seek to represent it, yeah, I do. I think that it's supposed to be something for regular people to be able to do. Now, whether or not those people would have the wherewithal to actually accomplish it, that's kind of another story.
My worry is actually later in the process. My worry is what happens to people without the wherewithal if they get in office and then they get gamed by a system because they don't understand it. I think this, frankly,
look at our president.
Or the incumbent I'm challenging, or the one in your race. What we're describing is the deference to careerism. And I think the qualification, the most crucial qualification for Congress at this day and age, is that you fought institutional power. Because if you didn't fight institutional power, you have no business going to Washington to fight the executive branch on behalf of the people of the United States. That is the most crucial qualification. So I respect your point in the abstract that anybody has a right to represent their community. In this day and age, if you're running for Congress, you damn well better have been fighting somebody, whether it's corporations or government agencies. If the only thing you did was raise money for a political party, and that's Nancy Pelosi's background, frankly, that's not qualifying at all. The first job of Congress is to check and balance the executive branch, to defend the Republic and the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and corporate fundraisers are not prepared, as we have seen demonstrated time and time again, to do it. And the point I want to emphasize here is that when that predictable smear is made toward you or me, it attains worse degrees than just inaccuracy or institutional punching down. It becomes, in your case, sexist, and in mine, racist. Because and to be clear here, the Bay Guardian, 48 Hills, it's a self-described progressive newspaper in San Francisco. And for the press to denigrate the achievements, accomplishments, and qualifications of people of color and women is deeply problematic, particularly when the incumbent hasn't debated in a generation and the press won't hold them accountable. So what I've seen, not only is it the roller coaster image and the runaway train image, but like if there is a roller coaster or a train, we're running for election in a democracy, there's an election apparatus, there's no track. When the incumbents don't debate and the press doesn't hold them accountable, and the only thing the press will print about you are lies, it's like you're on a roller coaster, but the rails aren't there. The rest of the process has eroded. Or maybe the bridge is out would be a more accurate.
You've just taken my roller coaster thing to the new level. See, now I have to add, and there's no tracks to the roller coaster, because you're right. Like there's no honor in it as an institution, and the parties that are participating in it don't act with honor. And that makes it hard, especially for people like you who are trying to work with honor in the system that is a very dishonorable system. And it's easier for people without honor to succeed in a dishonorable system. And that's what we're looking at. So let's talk a little bit about our friend Nancy.
Yes.
I will tell you that I remember as a little girl, I think I'm a little bit older than you, but I remember when she became the first female Speaker of the House. And I remember being so excited about that. Like that was a big deal. I was so excited. And then obviously now in retrospect, that's about as disappointing as Sandra Day O'Connor was, when I loved that one too. That was another real winner there too. But let's talk about how many years it's been since Nancy Pelosi has actually done something other than raise money.
So she's had a storied history in Washington, and I don't want to take away from it. She is the first female Speaker of the House. She's the first two-time Speaker of the House. Those are historic accomplishments. There's a chance, a not unlikely one, that she might end up the President of the United States before the end of the year. I mean, just given that the President has been, medically apparently incapacitated, and the Vice President, she's second in line for the presidency, right? So she's an incredibly accomplished, powerful, renowned female figure. And I've seen, for the 20 years that she's been my voice in Washington, I moved to the Bay Area in 2000 to go to law school at Stanford. And in the 20 years since then, I've fought a bunch of national struggles in San Francisco, in Washington, communities all across and between, particularly around surveillance issues, money in politics, marriage equality, human rights, torture, profiling, policing, immigrant rights. And on every one of those issues, Nancy Pelosi has carried water for conservatives, and not just recently. For decades, I watched her facilitate and enable CIA torture under the Bush administration. I watched her facilitate and enable predation targeting immigrants under the Obama administration. I watched her enable and facilitate military fraud, waste, and corruption and abuse from Iraq to Afghanistan, possibly to Brazil, Venezuela, and Bolivia in the last few years. We don't know, because this is, for me, where it gets really sharp. We were talking about the constitutional role of Congress to check and balance the executive branch, defend the Constitution. Part of what that means is representing we the people as representatives against the executive branch of our government. And in every example that I can think of where there has been an executive secret that we would want Congress to probe, Nancy Pelosi has sided with the executive branch against we the people of the United States and supported executive secrecy. And the tendency in Congress to enable secrecy, I fear, is the hole in the bucket of our republic and our constitutional design. If Congress gets co-opted, which frankly happened a long time ago, we the people are frankly vulnerable to getting fleeced. And I think that's exactly what's been happening for the last 70 years in the United States. And I'm tired of it. And I care about this country too much to watch it fall to ruin based on the intransigent abdication. It sounds oxymoronic, but like the one thing that incumbents seem committed to is not showing up for work when it most matters. And we, the people of the United States, deserve better than that.
I think that one of the most obvious examples of that a lot of people are familiar with is the authorization for use of military force, and basically how that has essentially eliminated Congress's authority regarding declaring war. It's almost like people don't understand how this works anymore. And we learned it a long time ago, but to anybody who's listening, only Congress can declare war. And yet yet. We seem to be, I believe we're drone bombing 8 countries or so right now. It's 7 or 8 countries, some sort of, and I don't even know if I believe that that's the only, for all we know, there's more. Who knows?
Right.
Really? I mean, I don't know.
There have always been more in the
Yeah.
past than were publicly acknowledged at the time. And that is I think you just seized on a central thing. People are aghast and alarmed at this criminal president and all the things that he's done that we know about. The worst acts of any administration come to light after the fact. We don't even know the depths to which this administration has sunk, frankly. And we can thank Nancy Pelosi for that, because she is an active agent of the secrecy that enables these abuses to continue. I'd be curious, when you talked about the AUMF, one of the things that I'm really eager to do, if I'm so fortunate to represent San Francisco in Congress, is to help force the gavel out of Nancy Pelosi's hands. And when you mentioned the AUMF in particular, it brings to mind Barbara Lee, who was one of the few members of Congress who stood up.
She was the only one.
That's right. And she was the only person in a body of 535 who understood the constitutional commitment to defend the people of the United States. And this point about war-making authority, it's not a small deal. This was very controversial at the founding of the Republic, the Federalist Papers. There was a long-running debate about whether to let the executive branch initiate war. And they invested that power in Congress for a reason, a very specific set of reasons, which is that you can't trust the commander-in-chief with the opportunity to initiate, precisely because it's inevitably politicized. So what did we do? We put a bunch of careerists in Congress who just follow the lead of the executive branch at every opportunity. And that's exactly why we've been at war in Afghanistan now for 20 years. And just to dial this up, it's the longest conflict in our nation's history. The last 2 empires that attacked Afghanistan not only got mired in quagmires that forced them to lose those conflicts, but it was the anvil on which those empires cracked themselves. Both the British Empire and the Soviet Union fell apart after trying to occupy Afghanistan. It is interesting to see the pattern. People have said, I don't know to whom to attribute this quote, but history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And we are certainly discovering that today in the United States.
Yeah. And just for anybody who doesn't know, and I always forget to sort of back up a little bit, but the AUMF is authorization for use of military force. I always forget to sort of do that for people who
thank you.
No, because we get used to just talking. And it came about after 9/11. And it was put in place basically as an emergency provision to allow our executive branch to go after, at the time, it was Osama bin Laden, it was Al-Qaeda, it was, getting into, digging into the Taliban. I mean, there was definitely what they put out as their reasons for it. But those have long since expired. And instead of undoing that, we keep perpetuating it over and over. And at this point, one would have to think that Congress isn't just complicit. They're actively in favor of it, because this isn't a matter of there hasn't been an opportunity for them to retract it, because there was. In fact, I know that Bernie specifically came out and tried to reestablish the War Powers Act in regards to Yemen specifically. I mean, and quite honestly, I was happy that it was being done regarding any of them. But arguably, to me, the AUMF shouldn't exist, and it's probably not constitutional at this point.
Right.
Right? I mean, you're a constitutional lawyer, right? I mean, that's right. So it's probably not constitutional at this point. But then with our courts and who we're being stacking on our courts, who is to say what's constitutional? So, but before we get off of the Nancy Pelosi thing, I have a question here, which is, what are her supporters like in San Francisco? I know what her supporters are in my district. I could describe them. I'm sure you know exactly what they look like, but who are they in San Francisco?
They might not be dissimilar. I mean, she tends to have support from older folks who've been long established in the community. She has a certain gravity and inertia as an incumbent who hasn't debated anyone for a generation. So she basically has the support of Democratic Party loyalists and old money in San Francisco. New money in San Francisco, particularly tech, is much less committed to Pelosi, precisely because many of those technologists understand science, and they particularly recognize the climate catastrophe and the role of corporate incumbents in facilitating it. So, I talked to, any number of people who might not identify as nearly as far left as me, who support our campaign because they recognize that between climate denial and delay on the one hand, and the Green New Deal and more, on the other hand, they recognize that the future needs us to show up today for a transformative alternative, that we can't just double down on the failed industrial paradigm that's led us to California being on fire while Houston's juggling hurricanes and, you know, who knows what calamities loom around the corner. These sorts of
you mean you don't think it's just about leaf raking? You don't think that if only you guys would just be out there raking your leaves better, that everything would just be under control there?
To be fair, indigenous forest management practices matter, but they're not the only thing that matters. Right?
I know that is a legitimate thing. I do know that because we actually have that here with the Everglades. There is intentional burning, and there are things that are done, and I do know that. But just the mere fact that he sort of attributed everything going on to, we're just not raking the underbrush. Yeah, I don't think so.
It was as bad as him throwing paper towels to people in Puerto Rico. In both cases, denying the climate catastrophe underlying the events. And this is a point, you know, we can't attribute any discrete event to climate chaos, but it is absolutely firmly established in the science that the warming of the planet is increasing both the severity and the frequency of weather events that used to be rare. And now we have once in a generation weather events like every couple of weeks somewhere. And here in California, you know, the cycle of sort of boom bust precipitation has just made the entire state, the entire West Coast, into kind of a powder keg. And to think about this season's wildfires, you know, millions of acres have burned. And it's not just an effect of climate chaos. It has become its independent cause and driver and accelerator. The amount of carbon that got spewed into the atmosphere from California and Oregon and Washington state's wildfires this year, it is more than any savings these states achieved from having better vehicle emission standards over the last generation. Like literally a generation's gains went up in quite literal smoke. And we're not done yet. We just started actual wildfire season. And this is every year it's getting worse. And we have to get a handle on this. And I think, you know, to your point about who Pelosi's supporters are, there are people who either in a lot of cases won't be here for the generation to endure the costs of her intransigent commitment to fossil fuel extraction, or it's people who don't pay enough attention to the issues to understand how she actually shows up in Washington. And this is an important point I'd also like to make. A lot of Pelosi's supporters might consider themselves progressive, but they are under the confused impression that she fights Donald Trump because that's what they hear on MSNBC or CNN or Fox News. They see her clapping, right? They see her rip a speech. They see her sternly put on her glasses. None of that matters. Ripping a speech does nothing for the kids in cages at the border camps that she funded. Clapping sideways, which she said was sincere, not ironic, does absolutely nothing to constrain the surveillance powers that Nancy Pelosi revived from the dead to extend and give to this criminal president after she had impeached him. Right.
So he's a crazy, unhinged person. So let's give him more money for his military budget and give him more power. Let's do that.
That's Pelosi's MO, but many voters don't know it. One reason they don't know it, frankly, this gets back to when we were talking about the metaphor of the roller coaster before, the invisibility or the erosion of the track. The press hasn't called it out. She's on Sunday shows every week. Nobody ever asks her, why are you doing so much to support the president? Nobody asks her, why haven't you debated anyone in 30 years? Nobody asks her, why don't you support Medicare for all in the middle of a pandemic or the Green New Deal while your state's on fire? She just gets softball questions. And then frankly, she falls apart at the hint of any pushback. And I can understand why her team won't let her debate me, because if she did, I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind how that would turn out. And it would be the end of her career. But the point here is it's not marginalizing to me or you when incumbents don't show up to debate. It's marginalizing to the voters in our democracy, and the press is supposed to be the guardian of those interests, but they, like corporate Democrats, somehow are just conspicuously invisible at the times when it matters most. And
well, I actually use this hashtag that I started a few years ago. I go RIP Fourth Estate. And I started with a journalism background. So I come from a journalism background. So that's something that's very particularly important to me and that I've been noticing for years. And this is across the board. I'd like to point out Nancy Pelosi is by no means the only establishment tool that is basically given a free pass from what are supposed to be the watchdogs of government, which is the Fourth Estate. That is the point of the free press. That's why they're given that right.
Yes.
And I think that people don't really understand that the First Amendment isn't really just about everybody being able to say whatever they want. I mean, yes,
Right.
that's fun, but the media aspect, the press aspect, is a critical component to our republic functioning, and we don't have that right now. And it's almost like it's happened somewhat gradually over 40 years. And like my parents will talk about, they remember Walter Cronkite. And there was a time when an actual journalist who would gather their own information would then sit down and report it. See, this is something that people can't wrap their heads around. Like even in the Dan Rather era, that's still a journalist. Those are still people that would hit the field and do what they needed to do and
Investigate.
would still investigate. Correct.
Yeah.
And now all we have are a bunch of talking heads that just go off of whatever tips whoever the power that be gives them to say. They're not independent. They're no longer, we don't have independent watchdog. And that's a huge problem.
I agree with you right up until the end. And maybe there's, I don't know, we might be dancing on a semantic pinhead here, but I would say that in some respects, the challenge is precisely that we have too many independent watchdogs. Like there's a proliferation of voices, which is a great thing. I think the democratization of media, particularly that the internet has enabled, is a great thing for our democracy. And to your point, the First Amendment privilege of the press, it is both to allow people to speak, but there is this core public function. The reason the freedom of the press has constitutional significance is precisely so that there are watchdogs. And that entails, this is the key part here, investigative capacity. And the proliferation of voices hasn't necessarily deepened the investigative capacity. If anything, it's lessened it because, we have a lot of noise at the opinion and analysis layer, and we have a dearth of facts.
Well, you're talking about just the media people. I mean, what I'm saying is there are no watchdogs in what we would consider mainstream media.
Yes.
There's nobody in the mainstream that's challenging the narrative. And that's a problem. And so for people like you and me, we'll go get our information elsewhere. And we're probably pretty decent at vetting what those sources are and knowing what journalists are legitimate. But most people don't have that skill. Right. And most people also, quite honestly, don't even know that they should be looking.
Yes, some of it's interest. Right. Right. I mean, we're sort of hyper citizens because we're organizers and activists and candidates. When people ask me how to get involved, my first recommendation is right on this point is just proactively curate your news sources. It's such a profound act. And so many people don't realize the need or the opportunity to do that. I'd be curious in your race, how did DWS sort of like pull the track up, so to speak, like, between not debating and like, what were the sort of experiences that you encountered as a challenger in terms of the establishment avoiding and eroding the process?
Yeah, there were, it's like I see three major arms of it that we were dealing with. I mean, the first thing was obviously the party establishment and our local DEC, our Dem clubs. They just ghosted us. To this day, they're still pretending that this race never happened. They are they would do forums for every other county race, whether it was sheriff, state attorney, whatever. And they never even invited us. They never, because for the same reason that they won't demand that Nancy Pelosi do a debate, they're not going to put Debbie on the spot either. So we have the party establishment that ghosted us. Then we have local media. And local media is extremely beholden to Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So with very few exceptions, there were a couple of conservative radio shows that would have us on. But anything that would be deemed towards the Democratic or the neoliberal side of things, we were just completely ghosted. But the third component that we have found that was extremely challenging and we're still working to chip away at was the labor unions.
Oh, God.
And breaking through, and the endorsement process and all of that song and dance, but the unions and the union leadership are so beholden to the establishment that they are no longer truly representing labor. And I'm very clear that I always stand with labor, always. Yep. But I do not always stand with unions because unions are not always acting in the best interest of their rank and file. So our AFL-CIO is very tight with Debbie, the head of our local. And he didn't even give me a screening, which apparently is a violation of their own bylaws. But they just did not. We would have meetings with individual unions and they would all say the same thing. We really like you. We'd love to get behind you, but this person. And
the same experience. Yeah.
So it's,
Oh.
so I look at it as like party, media, unions. And those, to me, it's like the trifecta of being blacked out in a district. Like that was my experience. You're having that as well, I see.
Yeah, we call it a whiteout because
Okay.
it seems to be much more, that's the more accurate dynamic here. But yeah, I so appreciate the way you delineated that, because in some respects, because specifically when you talked about how there's the party apparatus, and that's local and national, there's the local media apparatus, which is very beholden to the incumbent. And I think one of the things that you and I both found opportunities in was the independent, often not local press, to shine a light on campaigns and issues that the local press refused to cover. And that's an interesting sort of like suggestion of the opportunity that remains as these different forces are coming around. And in labor, I had certainly long acknowledged here as unfortunately part of the problem. And I stand like you in solidarity with labor.
Yes.
And the question is, does labor stand in solidarity with itself? And this is really disappointing, right? Because I would love to say march behind labor, except labor is marching behind corporate Democrats.
Yes.
And I'm not going to march in that direction. That's why we got here. And the inability of labor to demonstrate independence is, I'm not trying to cast blame here, but like we have a lot of structural issues that have led us into this corner. And one of them is that for at least 20 years, 30 years, if not longer, organized labor has taken its cues from institutional power holders instead of the rank and file. If organized labor was taking cues from the rank and file, Bernie Sanders would have been the president in 2016. We'd have had Medicare for all a long time ago. Organized labor is the key. And it's not just that it is eroded, and that's empirically, objectively true. Yeah. It has eroded and unfortunately lost its independence. And I think those things are connected, because one of the reasons that labor has eroded is because Democrats have abandoned it. The NLRB has just been off the rails for decades.
We don't have a labor party. We don't have a labor party in this country, period.
That's right.
And this is the massive problem. I find people, I'm sure, ask you about third parties all the time. I mean, that's one of the common questions is, what are your thoughts on third parties? And I'm, of course, supportive of any of that. But the reality is I'd be happy if we actually had two parties. We need a labor party. You cannot have capitalism without a party representing labor. And right now we have two corporate parties. So when you don't have a labor party, so we don't even have two functioning parties like that are actually have independent platforms and agendas.
We have one party with two brands.
Yeah, we have one party in two colors, and one party is a little bit more politically correct and says nice things about LGBTQIA, and the other party sends out mean tweets. So that's what we're dealing with. But the labor component is massive. And I know it's not as bad there, but in Florida, we're a right to work state. So labor is incredibly weak here to begin with, and which to me makes it riper for labor leadership to sort of like suckle up at the teat of corporate America and just sort of blame it on, oh, well, we're a right to work state. We don't have a lot of power here. And yet they can just continue to just go on and on and on. And they're just begging for scraps.
I want to tell one quick story here around the Protecting Right to Organize Act, which it was a bill that passed the House with Nancy Pelosi's eventual support this spring after she had opposed it from the point of its introduction. And I do want to give some credit where it's due here. Many labor leaders did step out this spring and invite her to support this groundbreaking transformative bill that, among other things, if it were ever passed by the Senate, would end right to work laws in the states by precluding them and requiring opportunities for organized labor participation. The point I want to make here is that when Pelosi abandoned her long opposition to the Protecting Right to Organize Act, she, as she has on half a dozen other issues over the course of the last year, she basically adopted positions that our campaign had taken first. And I see that as an indication of the value that campaigns like ours present in a democracy in terms of holding the incumbents accountable, basically forcing them to show up for work. I am the first Democrat in 30 years to ever reach a general election against Nancy Pelosi. And it is striking to me that in the last year, she's shown up far, far to her own historical left. The place where this has probably become most poignant also proves my point, and that's the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, separate issue, a few months after the Protecting Right to Organize Act passed the House. The Justice and Policing Act passes the House in response to a movement across the country defending Black lives. And the point I want to make here is that there were a bunch of components in the Justice and Policing Act, many. It was a wide-ranging bill. Nancy Pelosi had never supported any of them. Many of them I'd fought for a decade. The bill that they ultimately passed not only included many things I've long clamored that she has opposed, and I'm grateful for her finally figuring it out. Unfortunately, the bill expanded police budgets and surveillance, which is not what we were asking for in the streets. And just to compound the sort of salt in the wound here, while we were all in the streets saying their names, chanting justice for George Floyd, justice for Breonna Taylor, Nancy Pelosi takes the podium at the press conference introducing the bill and gets his name wrong, confusing him with a comedian from 50 years ago. And, you know, it's so on brand.
She had me at the kente cloth. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
That to me, like, was so symbolic of where we are and what people think is a solution on. And that's also across the board with Democrats. They're much more involved and interested in symbolic gestures, taking down Confederate monuments. Here we have a local commissioner that is, her focus is changing the name of our local Dixie Highway, because Dixie Highway is, you know, that somehow is racist. And what's interesting—
I'm down with changing names and taking down statues, but we can't pretend that that's it. Right.
That's the problem, is those are all very nice gestures. But when you do that, but then you turn around and you increase the police budget, we don't, you know, the people in our vulnerable communities, they're not that concerned with the name of Dixie Highway. I've asked them actually, and they're just not. What they're concerned about is jobs and eating. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that just really goes to what the Democrats are more about. And why do you think it is that so many progressives, what we do, we say we eat our own instead of building coalitions? And what have you experienced? I mean, you sort of briefly touched on that in San Francisco, that you've had that.
Oh yeah. Well, and it speaks to, you know, I'll remix it with the reflection you had on the Democratic clubs here in San Francisco. All the Democratic clubs, including some that had endorsed me, believed someone who ultimately later claimed to have accidentally accused me of assault. And it was that voice that they privileged over the first Democratic challenge to Pelosi in a generation. I'm the first person of color that DSA San Francisco ever endorsed. And, you know, then they kind of politically lynched me. And the idea of accepting accusations in spite of evidence and witnesses when the people accused are people of color, that is white supremacy. It doesn't take prejudice. And I don't think anybody in DSA San Francisco is racist.
I'm so disappointed by that. And interestingly, here, we had a state attorney candidate that was endorsed by our progressive state caucus. And then 2 weeks prior to the election, after some people already cast their ballots, he took $760,000 from George Soros. And the caucus still didn't retract their endorsement, which to me, it's, if you're taking corporate money, your de facto should not be getting a progressive caucus endorsement.
I mean, I think there's a thing here to particularly tease on, and that is just for people to explore and investigate facts, you know. And I think that when we're talking about accusations, particularly of public figures or people of color, particularly when we're remixed, you know, as a rare person of color who is running for office against an entrenched incumbent, I would just hope that self-described progressives wouldn't replicate the worst dynamics in our society by leaping to conclusions without evidence, and even in the spite of it. And just to make this clear, you know, any number of people locally spoke out in my defense, and one in particular whose voice has been suppressed that remains, frankly, astounding to me. The first news outlet to even quote her was The Intercept a week ago, 2 months after the fact, while she's been quite outspoken publicly. Gloria Berry is an Afro-Latina grandmother, Navy veteran. She's an elected member of the Democratic County Central Committee. She caught my critics telling lies, and at the same time that all the clubs are lighting me on fire as a person of color, they're also silencing and ignoring the voice of this woman of color, trying to say, these aren't women or workers holding accountable they're a bad boss. These are self-interested professional campaign operatives defending the establishment by lighting on fire, you know, using salacious accusations, a campaign that challenges power. And the idea that the entire organized left fell for it and shot itself in the feet. I might have been the target of these attacks, but the point I want to make really clear here is the ultimate victim is our democracy.
People don't get that. They think it's personal. And like, right. It's not personal, because all you're doing now is preventing the person who is going to forward the progressive policy. People just do not, because they see it like, oh, you're running for office. And that
right.
is—
I'm not doing this because I want it. I'm doing this because our country needs somebody else in the seat. There's all kinds of ways. Frankly, I would rather spend my time.
I know.
You know? like there's a privilege in doing this, but I'm not a careerist. If I was a careerist, I would have stayed at EFF. I had a great job at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And it's not like there's any job security in running against the Speaker of the House. I did this not because I, knew I could win, not because I, think, I'm the
You're not making friends anytime soon with that.
Right. I mean, I ran because for 20 years, I've been noting all of the failures of the establishment and the incumbent that led us here. And instead of saying, I told you so, I'd like to help going forward, but no good deed goes unpunished in this world. And I find particularly that on the left, there is something of an attitude of, as it relates to institutional power, people call it cancel culture, and that's fair. But, I'm not a white, wealthy, powerful institutional man. Like I don't have any institutional authority. I don't have any money. I don't have any wealth. All I have is an audience and a 20-year history of doing the right thing. But if you have anything on the left, it's enough to make you a target to somebody. And, the idea that there are people, whose idea of social activism is to burn things down is just a telling reflection, I think, I unfortunately fear our movement's incapacity to actually project influence and power at the scale that we need it to. And I do think of this as a failing of the organized left, from labor to the clubs. And all we can do as candidates is forcefully and boldly and convincingly articulate the case for alternative policies, how and why we can step into a brighter future. And I'm proud to have done that. I saw you do that. And at the end of the day, if you're on a roller coaster and there's no track, it's really hard.
It is hard.
Yeah.
And this is, I know you have to go, but this is, our podcast is called Generational Change. Yes, it's this cute play on words, but the concept really is we're transforming politics into service. And my campaign was very service oriented. I think that representatives' jobs are public service jobs. And that the key point is that even when a candidate doesn't win, the momentum and the actions that you're taking as part of your campaign is going towards the movement. It's all part of this movement to sort of get us where we need to go and build on itself. So I really appreciate your time. And before I let you go, though, I want to just ask you, I need to know, I need some random, quirky, weird thing that's a Shahid thing that hasn't been asked before. Like any weird things, any weird skills, talents, anything.
I play capoeira, so I do a little low-key breakdancing.
That's pretty cool.
I appreciate that. I mean, people know I'm a DJ and I'm a musician. I think I'm perceived more as a lawyer than I am as an artist, but I was an artist before I was a lawyer. And
you look more like an artist than a lawyer to me.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I tried to stay myself, even as I've done all these different things. This was another locus of racism locally. I had any number of socialists even tell me that I needed to cut my hair and my beard. And it's like, when you have self-described socialists basically offering racist advice, and they think they're being helpful.
Cut my hair too. They want me to cut my hair too.
You hear what I'm saying? And it's like, I just, yeah. But in terms of quirky things, that might be the one I'd really rest on.
Capoeira is pretty intense. I know someone who did that. That's a pretty badass thing. And so, but last question, what does generational change look like to you?
It looks like you and I being in Congress together. I think that the idea of ending the era of gerontocracy, and not just in Congress, but this is a point worth raising on the Supreme Court. Ro Khanna recently introduced a bill in Congress, and Andrew Yang endorsed a proposal that I wrote 10 years ago to end judicial life tenure. We have a commitment to insulating judges from the political process, and that's important. Life tenure is sort of like, using a hammer to smash a fly on a glass table. There's many ways short of so extreme a policy to achieve that end. And 18-year staggered terms for Supreme Court justices would do it. It would ensure that we wouldn't have a stranglehold on the future of our law and jurisprudence.
You say 18? You said 18?
18 was the suggestion.
I was wondering what people would think about doing what they do for federal magistrates. When I clerked out of law school, I was clerking for a magistrate, and it's 8-year terms that are subject to renewal. And that made sense to me as well. I definitely like the idea of terms subject to extension or renewal. I think that is the best way to do it. I definitely don't think they're elected positions.
Right.
But I agree. 18 is that's probably a really good number too. That's lucky. And, in Hebrew, that's chai. And chai is life. 18 is chai. So it's life. And so that's kind of interesting that you said 18.
Chai, like lochayim? Is it in the same?
Well, it's to life, but for some reason, the number 18 is symbolic of life. So like when you're going to a bar mitzvah or whatever, you generally will give denominations of 18. Or it'll be 180 and everybody in the community knows that 18 is sort of the symbol of life.
The reason we picked it is the reason for the staggered terms notion was just a multiple of 9. a multiple of the number of
Right.
justices to basically ensure that you have, in this case, you'd have every 2 years, there'd be a vacancy. And the predictability of it would keep it from being this like ticking time bomb. The incentives of it would sort of eliminate the idea of trying to pick stealth nominees and younger nominees to, maximize their influence on the court. It would ensure turnover.
People wouldn't be freaking out just because one person dies that the whole country is going to come to an end.
Exactly. This idea that the fate of our most basic rights rests on the health of this single individuals, whether it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg before or Donald Trump today, or the senators whose diagnoses will hopefully keep the Senate from proceeding. It is absolutely crucial that the next president appoint the next nominee.
Oh my God.
Just to note that, we're talking about holes in the bucket before, there's a big hole in that bucket because the last justice that Joe Biden put on the Supreme Court was Clarence Thomas.
I know.
So,
I remember that so clearly. And that's when people say, oh, but what about the Supreme Court? I'm like, yeah, he was very supportive of both Scalia and Thomas. And they've been kind of rubber stamping every one of Trump's appointees the whole time. I think Kavanaugh's the only one they even had the Mick resistance for.
That's right. And I fought the Kavanaugh nomination in 2006 to the DC circuit. I worked at the American Constitution Society for 3 years in Washington, preparing a pipeline of progressive jurists and trying to stop the rightward swing on the bench under the Bush administration. I watched the Obama administration basically run in the other direction. They didn't care about courts at all. The Obama, just like the Clinton administration's idea of responding to the Reagan-Bush attack on the courts, now Trump attack on the courts, what Obama and Clinton did was nominate more corporate lawyers, more prosecutors. They tried to make them diverse lawyers and corporate lawyers and prosecutors, and they called it a day. But, we don't need prosecutors on the bench. Frankly, I can't think of an institutional precursor to judicial service that should be more disqualifying than being a prosecutor. The whole point of judges is to be independent from the executive branch. Prosecutors come from it. It is far and away the most frequent path to the bench. And that's part of why we're in this mess, because we have judges that are supposed to check and balance their former colleagues. And, that's not just true at the lower level. It's absolutely true on SCOTUS. Like every one of the recent nominees had service in one of the right-wing departments, usually the Office of Legal Counsel. That was true of Alioto. It was true of Gorsuch. It was true of Roberts. I believe it was true. Yeah, it was absolutely true of Kavanaugh as well. And these are basically weaponized conservatives who've been groomed to take over our courts. And this is exactly why we have to end judicial life tenure, to force some turnover on the bench and give us a shot at having real justice again.
I agree. And I know you got to go. So thank you so much, Shahid. I appreciate it. And to anybody, if it isn't obvious, clearly I endorse Shahid Buttar. I am a supporter. And I think nothing could be better than getting Nancy Pelosi out of Congress. So that being said, everybody check out Shahid. And will you give me, shout out your website? And, yeah.
Thank you, Jen. Folks can visit us online at shahidforchange.us. We're also on all the major social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, at Shahid for Change. So grateful to be with you today. Really,
I will put that over it. We'll superimpose that. So when this goes out, it'll have all your information, but I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Shahid. Bye.
Great to be with you, sister. Take care.